in the cards anytime soon.
I wanted to return to incest for a minute,
Yeah.
because your arguments are very commodious and appealing to me that way, because they leave radically open what a household would look like, what a marriage would look like, and all the many legal and social reasons for polygamy and for incest. And not just child care, but elder care. I mean, it's very reasonable that I should want to marry my mother and father, since I'm going to be entrusted with their care, and for tax reasons, inheritance, gift tax, all manner, and even if I'm having sex with them, it's not going to be procreative at this point, so the incest ban on medical terms wouldn't apply. I'm not asking this to be frivolous, because there are enormous numbers of healthcare is a big issue with elders and with spouses, and same-sex spouses not having access to it. But it's also the one really powerful argument against gay marriage that is made that you didn't address, which was the slippery slope argument, which leads to a certain moral panic reaction. That says, well, if gay marriage now, what next? Polygamy, incest?
Yeah, I mean, I have a problem with that argument and with what to do about it in this book, because this book is part of a series that my colleague Jeff Stone edits, which is for the general public, which is an attempt to, therefore persuade the general public on constitutional issues. And I've been torn about several questions where my own views are actually quite radical, but I feel like putting that up front might weaken the persuasive power of my arguments. And one is this area, and the other is the whole question of sex clubs, public sex, and so on. Well, on the second, I bit the bullet, and I have this whole chapter on sex clubs and public sex, which is pretty radical, I suppose, in terms of the general public. But on this, I just have been a little more evasive, although as time went on, I kept rewriting it and adding more of my own critique of the current prohibitions. Now, I think, for me, bestiality is in a completely separate category because it's an infliction of harm to animals without their consent. And I think there's just no way of claiming that an animal has consented to sexual intercourse. And in the absence of that clear evidence of consent, I mean, my view on rape more generally is, intercourse is not, there's rape unless there's positive affirmative evidence of consent. So that's, for me, the easy one, but for completely different reasons from the ones that most people seem to give. Polygamy and incest, polygamy I've actually written that I think, if you think what are the state interests, well, the sex equality one seems to me to be the only one that's very strong. But then suppose you have something like Liz Emmons has proposed, that is polyamory, that's sex equal, a kind of contractual sexual relationship among a group of people. I see no good reason against it. I mean, you could bring out administrative complexity, but then you'd have to see how far that would actually take you. Now, if, for example, then it depends what the argumentative context is. If some religious group, let's say the Mormons said, this is a religious commandment, and we are going to pursue a free exercise claim, then at least under the Sherbert regime, the state would have to show a compelling state interest. What would that be? Well, I think administrative complexity has repeatedly failed to pass that test. It's not it may be a state interest, but I don't think it's a compelling state interest. So I actually think that at least if that was the argumentative context, polygamy would have to be permitted. So anyway, that's my view on that. I just sort of, you see how I dealt with it rather concessively, saying I think the arguments are weak, but at any rate, at present, we can see that states have these arguments. Incest, again, I think child abuse is a huge problem. And so given the huge size of that problem, a bright line rule on parent-child incest seems to me absolutely fine and defensible. But then when you get to the brothers and sisters, well, now we know so much about the genes, and we certainly don't forbid people with Tay-Sachs and so on to get married. So I feel that it's just bad faith to forbid the brother and sister on these putative health grounds. If at one time states did think that they had that interest, they don't have that anymore. And as you say, there may be, I'd have to think more about this. If we could have a bright line rule that would somehow allow the elderly to marry their... But you see, then I think what we really need to handle your kind of case is this disaggregation. We have to think, what kinds of groupings do we want to give rights to in the area of tax, inheritance, immigration? And, what Warner does, pointing to the French experience, is to say, look, people who share a household, whether they're brother and sister, father and mother, or something, they should be able to get certain kinds of benefits that are appropriate to that status, and that doesn't have to involve having sex at all. And then maybe those who have sexual relations would get other, or would get other kinds of benefits, such as adoption rights. So we could sort it out. But to do that, we have to first think, and people are just unwilling to think. They would rather stick to the status quo rather than to think. Now, of course, in the thought process, we'd have to think about how the healthcare system would be structured. And best of all would be that all individuals would have satisfactory healthcare. Then we wouldn't have to engage in these games that you're talking about with the insurance companies. So I think that's the best solution there. But anyway, yeah. So I think it's very frustrating, because the best solution, which is really to sit down and think, well, each of these benefits that's traditionally associated with marriage, to whom do we really want to extend this, given our current social knowledge and our current situation? And that process is just not happening.